Okay, so we're here to speak about herbs today, and just as a preface, one of my favorite topics to speak about. Their herbs could be quite expensive when you have to purchase them, and they're fairly easy to grow. So I love encouraging gardeners to grow these, and whether you're an experienced gardener or just starting, I'll kind of touch upon a lot of good things, more advanced and maybe for beginners. So you'll get a well-rounded talk today. And just want to thank you all for joining me. I know the weather's lovely out there, certainly in my neck of the woods of Chicagoland. Looks like rain's coming, but I appreciate you being on your computer and not in your gardens right now, just so you could keep the creative juices flowing and get some education. So I will make this beneficial to you all. Okay, I will start recording too. Okay, so my name is Nancy Creeth. I'm a horticulture educator with University of Illinois Extension in Cook County. And I work a lot with master gardeners, and just if there's master gardeners on, you really make our program a lot better. Certainly enrich it. And I want to thank you for your volunteerism and keeping active, especially during the pandemic. Okay, so herbs, really they're really just a useful plant by a lot of definitions. So we see them used in flavoring and crafts, certainly for aromas, scenting, landscaping. A lot of people don't think about using herbs in the landscape, but they could be quite ornamental. So I'll touch upon some of the herbs that do have good characteristics for landscaping. And then I have medicine here in parentheses, because I won't speak to that so much, but know that there is a lot of information out there on how herbs could heal. And a lot of people use them for a medicine or a holistic approach. You know, I'm not trained in that field, I'm not in the medical field, so I won't speak to that today. But there certainly is a lot of research out there for you to investigate on your own. One thing I always like to do when I'm working in the garden is try to make use of these herbs. So pictured here, we have that little sachet, and usually we don't have enough lavender blossoms to make a sachet like that. So oftentimes I'm purchasing lavender blossoms, and they were less expensive than I thought. And what we do is we do this with a lot of special needs groups is they love the aroma. We grow a lot of herbs and we'll dry them by hand, but just by air drying. But we'll also get lavender flowers and make these sachets, and they love doing that. And the aromas that enter the room and the building, people are always stopping by to say, what's going on? It smells so good. So it's very uplifting. And I'll tell you, when I couldn't garden during the winter, I buy a lot of fresh basil or fresh herbs, and that just brings those aromas indoors and into the kitchen. And it's just, very, very uplifting. So I encourage you to try to cook with more fresh herbs. They're certainly healthier for flavoring, over something like salt. So a lot of creative things out there as far as other crafts go. I love that wreath picture that I found online. So get creative when you're harvesting your herbs if you're not using them for culinary purposes or scenting. So growing herbs, I mentioned this, it's easy if you know how. And I say that because a lot of people may over water herbs. So, that's one of the worst things you could do. A lot of these we'll talk about their origins, and they're typically grown in dry, rocky soil. So they like the humidity, but they don't like their feet wet. So you want to really be careful with not overwatering them. That's the biggest tip. And there are very few insects or disease problems. A lot of people say that herbs help to repel insects. And I would just say, look to different studies. It really depends on the species. But if you're looking at intercropping or something like companion planting to pair vegetables with herbs, just do your research and see if there's evidence how well they may repel or deter insect feeding your crops. Certainly having that supply for fresh cooking, right? It's going to save you a lot of money. As I mentioned, herbs are quite expensive and sometimes hard to find out of season. So it certainly will save you money if you're going to harvest these and use them in cooking. And you could preserve them easily by drying. Some people freeze them. And I want to mention that I did have some additional handouts, so make sure I am the one that emailed you with a link to the handouts. And besides this slide set, you'll see something on starting seeds with herbs. It's getting a little bit late in the season to do that indoors, but some that are quick growing, you still have time. And also how to dry and preserve some herbs. So please check out those handouts in addition to the slide set. Of course, they're going to have some fragrance. A lot of times you might have to rub your hands to emit that fragrance in the air. And if you are not using your herbs for culinary purposes and you allow them to bloom, then they're certainly going to feed pollinators. Herbs are certainly a go-to for me to feed my pollinators as a nectar source, and some are even host plants. So speaking of host plants, a couple that come to mind are common rue and the parsley family will feed these little guys, swallowtails. The common rue is for the giant swallowtail, and the parsley family is for the black swallowtail. Also, borage is a host plant for the painted lady. So that's where the larva will feed on the leaves. And if you plant dill or parsley, you certainly will see these guys eventually. And this is one of our overwintering native butterflies, the black swallowtail. So before you begin, you really want to decide, how are you going to use these herbs? Is it for the taste? Is it for use, look? Do you want them to bloom for pollinators, or do you want to harvest them before they bloom? Because ideally, for the best flavor, you'll want to harvest your herbs for culinary purposes before they bloom, okay? And then again, how are you going to treat this herb annually? Is it an annual that you want to try to overwinter indoors or treat as a house plant? So I have great success with overwintering basil indoors. Some of the other ones are a little bit tricky, and we'll get into that as we get into the program. But basil is one of the easier ones to overwinter. Usually as I bring it inside in the fall, I'll cut it back, by probably about a third, harvest what I can, and then encourage new growth. And I'll have to place that certainly in a sunny window or under supplemental lighting. And then of course there's perennial herbs. So those are herbs that will come back each year. So you'll have to find a permanent location for those in your garden. So location, ideally you want to have good air circulation. So you don't want to plant things too close, allow for some air to get in between there so you're not prone to some diseases that might come in. But typically in containers, people plant them quite heavily. So you could see in this photo here, there's probably 8 to 10 herbs in this one pot. And this is probably a pretty large pot. It almost looks like the size of an earth box, or maybe a 1 by 3 foot size, probably about a foot depth. So the reason you could plant these so tightly in here is there's good optimum drainage, right? It's nice that it drains well, and that's going to keep them happy as well. But if you're in the landscape, certainly you could space out your herbs and allow for better air circulation. Most herbs are going to need that full sun, so 6 hours or more per day. Now there are a few that will tolerate part sun, and those are chives, cilantro, parsley, and mint. So I have good success with those in some dappled sunlight. Soil, I mentioned a little bit about this before, but certainly most need well-drained and low fertility. You never want to overdo it with fertilizing too much, because it can basically lose some flavoring of the herbs. So it's only if they're giving you signs that they need fertility, maybe yellowing of leaves, that you should supplement fertilizer. And then a couple will tolerate wet soils, and that includes chives and cilantro. Now, when you're growing herbs in containers, there's some advantages and certainly requirements. The drainage is excellent. They are portable, so you could certainly bring them indoors and overwinter them, or sometimes tuck them in a crawl space or a garage. I have success with overwintering herbs in that way. Thyme is one that's pretty tough, and I overwinter that in my containers in the crawl space. and then I'll bring it out as the weather warms and cut it back a bit. And then gets a head start of just starting to grow, in April, rather than planting it maybe a little bit later. So that's a nice way to overwinter those in containers. Certainly you can move these indoors for winter. I always inspect things. Usually I will give them a harsh cut back because I want to encourage new growth. And they're certainly going to be in a bit of shock. So don't be surprised if they, start to lose a lot of leaves and dry out. Ideally, you want to have them in a sunny window and keep some humidity up so they could do well indoors. So with the requirements, good appropriate size container, of course, with drainage holes. You still see these decorative pots with no drainage, and that just doesn't work because the water needs a place to go and it'll run out the bottom with those holes. And then your loose, well-drained potting medium. So you're usually looking for a peat-based product, or core is the ground up coconut husk that is a bit more sustainable of a product. So look for your potting mixes, really called the soilless mix when you're growing herbs in containers. So I mentioned some are perennials. Then we have our annuals, which will only live about 1 year. We'll review those. Few biennials in the herb group, and those take 2 years to live their life cycle. And then perennials are 3 or more years. And again, this is given that they're in the right environment. So I have people report that their lavender didn't make it. So it's kind of borderline cold hardy in our Chicagoland region. So you want to be careful. There's better cultivars and others that might tolerate our winter. And I'll give you another tip as we talk more about lavender. So in the annual group, we have these listed here. So these are fairly easy to grow indoors. And I would just simply, sometimes I overwinter them at the end of the season, or sometimes I'll just start by seed in a sunny window or under supplemental light. So I mentioned that moisture is really key. And so what I like to do is use these closed sealable bags. And what I'll do is put a potting mix in there and then direct seed those. And these are sitting in a sunny window. And this is how I get a little bit of herbs year round. And so this is just me direct seeding over and over throughout the winter months to have some fresh herbs growing. Some do better than others. You could see my rosemary in the front, and that bag is very slow to start. That's a tender perennial. So that's a little bit trickier by seed. But I have arugula, basil, and cilantro, and those are very easy to grow by seed. So our perennials here, again, if they're in the right place, right climate, they will come back. Just like other perennials, they may need division every 3 to 5 years. So if they're starting to flop or die out in the center or just not performing well, you see that they're overcrowded, go ahead and divide those. So you could, cut them in half, cut them in 4s. I like to, depending on the size of the plant, you could cut it in half and then dig both portions up and recenter that plant in the hole. And then you'll have an extra plant to plant elsewhere in your garden. So just listed here are some of the perennials. And I just have a couple pictures in here where certainly these perennials at the bottom photo overwinter in this bed, and the perennials there are mint and sage. The biennial there is parsley. And so our tender rosemary in the foreground, along with the annual basil, that won't overwinter. But this bed is fine with overwintering our perennial herbs, and it's about 3 foot deep. Additionally, above those in the containers, we've been successful with overwintering lemon balm in a pot, and also thyme in that earth box style container. And that's just by tucking them against a building, southern exposure, where you get some radiant heat from the brick building, and they survive the winter. So that's not always 100%. If we get a very harsh winter, they might take a toll on them, but you could certainly try it. It does work from time to time. So I mentioned our rosemary here, some of these rosemary, sweet marjoram, these are perennial, but not tender. I mean, excuse me, but not hardy. So we consider these tender perennials. They will not survive our winters in Illinois. So a lot of times you'll either bring these inside, treat them as an annual, and certainly if they're going downhill, as you bring these indoors, you could do root cutting. So depending on the best propagation method, for one with rosemary they do great from root cuttings and water. And so always, if you're looking to propagate herbs, do your research, and I'm happy to answer questions later on specifics, but certain ones are better propagated by seed, certainly by division, or some by cuttings. So I mentioned this before, a lot of herbs need that minimal watering. You know, this is the environment of all the herbs listed here. Their origin is from Mediterranean area, so very drought tolerant, minimal watering, growing in this harsh environment here. But they do have a lot of moisture in the air, so that is very helpful. So I always try to mimic this environment as best I can in my own garden to have these herbs perform their best. Okay, so now we're going to jump into different types of herbs. So herbs for flavor. Here's one, arugula. Some people will consider this a leafy green. I certainly could consider it a herb. It has that pungent flavor and could be mixed in with things, or certainly eaten on its own in a salad. So this is an annual, does great direct seeded, and this is a cool season annual. So I'll be getting ready to direct seed arugula in my area around April 1st. So consider it a cool season crop, and you'll be planting this in your area about 4 to 6 weeks before the frost free date of your area. Okay, it does need full sun and does well in containers. Basil, probably a lot of people on the call's favorite, certainly gets the appetite going, and there's hundreds of varieties of basil. So you're seeing a cinnamon basil in the top photo, and then a purple leaved basil at the bottom. This is an annual. Again, look for these different varieties. There's Thai basil that has a little bit of spice. There's lemon basil for adding flavors to your teas. This is definitely going to love full sun. This is one that will take a bit more water than the other herbs. So I find myself certainly watering basil more than my other herbs. When you get into these different colors and textures, there's some with ruffled leaves. There's this cute little boxwood basil that you could use as an edging plant. So that's how I have used basil in the landscape. And then so many uses in the kitchen. I think this is a big time Italian herb go-to. And we mentioned basil pairing with tomatoes earlier in the chat box. And that's just a lovely combination. Cilantro, also known as coriander. So cilantro, when it goes to flower and set seeds, those seeds are the coriander spice. So same plant. Sometimes I like to harvest it for the leaves, but some people will allow it to flower and harvest it for the seed to use as coriander. So whatever your preference is, by far, I like to direct seed cilantro. It does a lot better direct seeding. And this is another cool season plant that likes that cool weather, and I'll treat it as I'm planting it with the arugula. I'll get it out again 4 to 6 weeks before that frost free date, direct seed it. And then it tends to stay low and bushy. Otherwise, it might have a tendency to bolt right away if you find it as transplants. So it'll shoot up that flower head and start producing seeds. And with my annuals like this, I'll direct seed it. I'll cut, as it gets large enough as pictured here, I will end up cutting this back almost to the ground, and it will regenerate and get me another big harvest. The downside of cilantro is that it's just a lot of times it's not ready when my tomatoes are ready, because tomatoes are warm season. So, when I'm trying to make that pico de gallo, I don't have my fresh source of cilantro. So that's one downside, but typically I'm planting this in the spring and then again late summer. So I do get a bumper crop in fall to pair with some of my tomatoes. Again, the other thing is it has a tap root, so you want to be very careful with planting that, and that's why it's better direct seeded. And then I see it's used, again, it gets some uses for the leaves and seed. Okay, dill. So this is one that people may shy away from because it can be quite aggressive. Dill tends to spread by seed. And some of these annual herbs will spread by seed, or you might consider them, well, I thought this was an annual. It's not, why is it coming back the next year? And that's just because seeds overwinter and then pop up in your garden the next year. So dill is notorious for that. You can see all these umbel flowers. Oh, they're great for pollinators, but once they start setting seed, I'll get out there and harvest these flowers. And I love to use them in pickling. You could see that these are in containers. They're doing pretty well. And it's partner fennel. If you look in that image, fennel's related to dill. That is all of it reseeding outside of the container. So fennel's another one that's notorious for reseeding and could easily take over a garden. So the best thing for that is to, remove the seeds before it happens. So you really have to be on it when it comes time to harvest or just deadheading. So you could simply deadhead, save the seed, or you could use the flowers in purpose of kitchen dishes. It does give a misty effect in the landscape, so that could be interesting. And certainly our beneficials love landing on those flat umbel flowers. Italian parsley. So this is the biennial of the group. A lot of people just treat it as an annual, but it will come back after the first year and then start to set its small white flowers. This is another one that I see tolerate a little bit of part sun. So if you don't have that full sun area, this could be a good go-to. A lot of times it's used in soups and stews, egg dishes. That's how I find myself using it. And I have used it as a border before, and it's okay. I mean, it does have nice shiny leaves, very green. So if you needed something for your part sun, this could work in a landscape situation. It certainly is slow from seed, so you just might have to wait a while if you're direct seeding or opt to get transplants. Oregano. So this is perennial, very aromatic leaves. Love drying oregano. Personally, I use it a lot, but I think it is one of the more common herbs used. There are a few different species of the oregano. So we have Greek oregano and sweet marjoram. And just remember that sweet marjoram we treat that as an annual in our area of Illinois because it is tender. So oregano could be fairly useful as like a edging or around stone paths. And if you allow it to bloom, it will have these white to pink clusters and could look fairly attractive. Again, if you want to use it for the kitchen, certainly harvest it before it blooms. Rosemary, another tender perennial. So it's very attractive. If you ever go down south in the US, this is like an evergreen. I was in New Mexico and they had a shrub border of rosemary. I was so jealous. But I love treating this as an annual here, and I do try to overwinter it indoors. It's a little bit more tricky. So again, don't forget that method of doing the root cuttings, or simply putting a root, some of the roots in water. A lot of times I will harvest herbs and stick them in a vase of water, and it gives them some longevity in that realm. And I still keep those in a sunny window. So ideally you want this in full sun. It'll be moist but well drained. It's a great use in the landscape as texture. So when you have these fine leaves and you compare them with the coarse leaf, it really adds dimension in the landscape. I love pairing this with something like sage's coarse leaves next to the fine leaf of rosemary. And certainly many uses in the kitchen. I see people use, if you really want to impress your friends during a fancy barbecue, You could cut a sprig and put your marinade on whatever you're marinating with a nice sprig of rosemary. Okay, sage. This is a very long-lived perennial, and I think it could add a lot of dimension to the landscape. It could bloom fairly nice. You see some sporadic blooms here, but it has this great pale color, really stands out in the garden. You could always trim back the flowers if you like it more so for the foliage. Certainly a lot of different varieties out there. And in the top picture, you could see more of this compact variety. I'm not sure of that variety, but how it's paired with the fine leaf and just how simple and that container could be, but what a nice contrast and add a nice pop to your garden. Of course, full sun again. I could see you using this not only in containers, but a border to mid border section of your landscape. And of course, this is tied to the traditional Thanksgiving dinner and stuffings, certainly in meat dishes. What this does, it absorbs a lot of the meat, the oils and meats, and helps with the digestion. So that's why you'll see it in a lot of things used like sausage. Thyme. Again, a lot of varieties of thyme in the landscape. I love the compact, the more of the ground cover, woolly thyme. There's even sometimes that will tolerate some footsteps. So I love putting that around stepping stones. And then when I walk along them, it emits that aroma, just to die for aroma. I really love the smell of this. Of course, everyone has their own taste, but really lovely lemony smell. If you're not using it around stone paths, it could be used in edging or rock gardens. And then certainly in the kitchen, soups and stews or meat dishes. And here you could see it blooming. Okay, so now let's get into herbs for color. Pictured here is rue in bloom. I mentioned rue as being a host plant for the giant swallowtail. So it does have, when it's not in this yellow bloom, it has these pale kind of cut leaves that are really sharp and stand out in the garden as well. Okay, so borage. Borage is an annual. Again, you might see it. It's certainly notorious again for reseeding. So if you plant borage and it comes back the next year, it certainly survived, its seed survived, and that's how it's regrowing. And this, the image on the top, it starts out fairly small when you put it in, but that's one season's growth. So this could get up to 2 feet tall in one season, grows quickly, edible flower here. And what a lot of people might do is, which is just so cute, is put the flowers into ice cubes and freeze them. And then it's just a nice summery drink when you add that to your lemonade or iced tea. Some people will crystallize the flowers, like dust them in sugar and serve them that way. They kind of have to me, they have a melon taste, and you just pluck off the petals and we'll eat that. But certainly valued for our pollinators, and has this nice blue flower. So it could add some nice characteristic to your landscape as well. Chives. I find chives to be one of the most underutilized plants. They come out early and they bloom, so they're great for our pollinators that are foraging in early spring. I think they get a bad name because they tend to reseed as well. But what I do is, after these flowers are spent, I get out there and deadhead them. And so I almost cut the whole plant to the ground. Here, these are grown in containers, but I would treat them the same. After the flowers are starting to turn brown, I will cut back almost to the base of the plant. And believe me, these will grow back and sometimes even rebloom. Usually it's a sporadic rebloom, but they do come back. I've eaten these flowers too. They're very strong, but add a nice onion flavor to dishes. So you could eat the leaves or the flowers. And again, certainly attractive when other stuff is yet to bloom in the spring, and great for our pollinators. I've successfully overwintered chives in containers just against a brick building on the south facing side. So they are easy to overwinter in containers. Now, its partner, garlic chives, another gets a bad name because it is a bit aggressive. So again, I'm really on top of it when it comes to deadheading these more aggressive plants that spread by seed. But I love this one because it's a late bloomer. So opposite end of the standard common chive, we have our garlic chives, which have more of a garlic flavor when you eat the leaves, and they have a white blossom in late summer. So again, when I might have little blooming things, or a lot of things are winding down, these are just starting to pop. I find that these will take a little bit more of the dappled sun. I see them used in the kitchen as in stir fries, and certainly just like our common chive, you could use the flowers as a garnish. Nasturtium, probably one of my favorites here. I love this by Direct Seeding. There's so many varieties out there. Pictured here, the one trailing is a Ford hook trailing type. And the key with these is I like to soak the seed. I like to nick the seeds. So I like nick them with a nail file and then soak them the day before. And that's really going to help with germination. To have a tough seed coat. And you'll see when you see these seeds that you really need to break that and help them out. So nick them and soak them before you're direct seeding these, and wonderful use in the landscape. Just different varieties of colors, usually your warm colors, your yellows, your oranges, your reds. Again, getting the more compact one. There's an Empress of India one that has more of a blue color leaf, and that adds a lot of interesting color, but also texture. These are kind of a one-of-a-kind leaf that almost remind me of a lotus or a lily pad leaf. And I love, again, for containers or edging where you could have some trailing going on, that Ford hook trailing type is really nice. Of course, you could eat these as well. So people put these in salads or as a garnish, and the flowers are edible and have kind of a peppery, spicy flavor. Okay, getting into herbs for fragrance. Okay, English lavender. So this is a perennial in our area. Some are a little bit more hardy than others. If we have a harsh winter, you might see yourself losing some of your lavender. Ideally, you really needs well-drained soil. This will not tolerate wet feet whatsoever. So full sun, well-drained, and don't overdo it with any supplemental watering. So ideally, they work great in rock gardens, certainly as an edging flower border, containers. And the trick to English lavender is don't cut it back. So certainly don't cut it back in the fall, but in the spring, you want to leave that old growth above ground until you start to see new growth at the base. So I think that's one common mistake where people might lose their lavender if they cut it back too early. So just hold off on cutting that back until you see new growth in the spring. And people will use this as a jam, vinegar, any scenting. I see it dried into different types of salts and sugars, and that's kind of a nice addition to adding things to your cuisine. Lemon verbena. This is probably one of the most lemon aroma herbs out there. It is a tender perennial. It could really be a woody shrub. Very, very aromatic. It ranges from a foot to 2 feet tall. Now, this is one that's a heavy feeder. So this is an exception. Normally, I said you're not fertilizing your herbs. Well, this is one that you're going to have to do some supplemental fertilizing. And to this one I find is difficult to overwinter. So I like to propagate this by tip cuttings. And I mainly will use this in the landscaping containers. And then you see it in a lot of different dishes and certainly flavoring beverages. Mint, lots of different mint species out there. There's peppermint, spearmint. This is a perennial and quite an aggressive perennial. I like to use it as a ground cover in troublesome areas or in a container. Of course, people like to use it in a lot of drinks. Of course, you might have your favorite cocktail, but also teas, certainly garnish, or in salads or vegetables. Of course, word of caution. I'm sure a lot of you are, when is she going to mention the word of caution? If you don't want to treat this as a ground cover where you want it to spread, you'll want to sink it in pots. And just if I back up once, this is what we did in one garden is put it in these pots, or sometimes people even bury the pots because it will spread by runners. There are a few that are not quite as aggressive: apple mint, chocolate mint, pineapple mint, still a little bit aggressive. So I always advise to keep your mints in pots. You might see these things growing in a crack of a sidewalk if they're soil. That's how aggressive they are. So you want to be careful with mints. Okay, and then just to hit home with some few uncommon herbs. So I didn't want this to be just basic. I want to introduce a couple other uncommon herbs. And again, herbs are a useful plant. So pictured here is St. John's wort, and you could certainly think of this as an herb, right? And more of the medicinal side. So I am lucky enough to have a specialty herb grower close to me. So I always go investigate their different varieties. And I came across this Cuban oregano. Some people will call it Mexican mint or Indian borage, but it's very succulent leaves. And it's a tender perennial here. It will range from 1.5 feet to about 3 foot. Again, with these succulent leaves, it's telling me must be well-drained soil. I've only used this in a container, but I think maybe you could get away with it in a border. And then in the kitchen, it's really, it's very strong and can overpower dishes. So you would only use it a very little, and most people are using it with meat or gamey dishes or in a stuffing. So yeah, try to find this one, Cuban oregano. And then ornamental oregano, the one pictured here is Kent Beauty cultivar. And so this is kind of borderline depending where you are in Illinois. It's hardy to zone 6. This is a hybrid, and these beautiful bracts, also flowers. They have this pink color from summer to fall. So it just really pops. I mean, just look at that. What an interesting plant. It does like that full sun, dry to medium soil. And as it gets established, it's heat and drought tolerant. So that's great. And especially as a border plant where it might dry out next to a sidewalk. You could also use it as a ground cover in rock gardens or containers. And a lot of people will use this in dried flower arrangement. And that goes for a lot of herbs. Oftentimes I cut herbs if they're in bloom and use them as dried flower arrangements, and they last quite long. And if it ever gets a little scraggly, you could always prune it back to encourage new growth. Now this one, wow, this one popped me in the face when I was at that specialty growers. This is a lemon scented geranium, specifically the colocho. I believe that's how you pronounce that. This is an annual, and it has these crinkly leaves, and it's kind of on the expensive end for an herb. But if you just rub your hands against these leaves, it's unbelievable. The lemon / rose scent you're getting. It just takes you away. So gorgeous plant. I've only used it in containers or maybe as an accent. It doesn't get too big. I think it would be hard to be a standalone plant in the landscape. So I more so use it in containers, but wow, the aroma is to die for. So if you could find this one, check it out. And then pineapple sage. So this is great for a landscape use. It's a tender perennial, so it's not going to come back. It does have aromatic leaves, but I'm mainly growing it for this late blooms. And this just took over our whole bed come late summer. It got up to 5 feet tall in one season. So you're looking at mid border or even a backdrop. It certainly could stand on its own as an accent plant. And I love that, it's blooming like September in my area. It could also be used in teas and jellies. Now let's just jump into some general herb care before we wrap up. So here, I just wanted to show this photo because here I can see some nitrogen deficiency. This was at one of our gardens, and you could see that's basil there. That's looking okay. I could notice a little bit yellowing leaves on the lower parts, and then the thyme looks a little bit straggly. So, seeing that this is in a container and, they may have used a sterile potting medium, meaning there was no fertilizer. So you could certainly, determine that this needs to be fertilized at this point. I would probably cut that time back to encourage new growth, and then I would hit it with a nitrogen-rich fertilizer to help green up those leaves. So something like, if you're going organic, blood meal, or even watering it with something like fish emulsion would be great. Or you could go with urea for your synthetic fertilizer. So in containers, from time to time, you may see some nutrient deficiency. Pruning herbs. So you'll see this is basil here. And if you don't want your basil to bloom and support pollinators, you want to more so grow it for culinary purposes, or you want it to remain compact and more dense growth, then as this starts to blossom, you'll just come in here and pinch off that blossom. You could do that with your fingernail. You could certainly use scissors, but you want to continually deadhead or trim off these flower buds. Okay, and that's going to keep your, it basically tricks the plant into producing more leaves, because this is an annual. It wants to live its life cycle. It wants to set its seed. So you just have to keep at it to pinch those off, and that will keep a more tight, compact plant and not allow it to flowering where the leaves will turn bitter. Harvesting herbs. I took an herb class at U of I, and I thought this was such a great idea when, it's hard to, water, really rinse and wash herbs and then dry them in the same day. So what my professor liked to do is she would go out to her garden and hose down her herbs the night before she was going to harvest them. And so that was one way to wash them. And then the next day, they're fairly clean. You could harvest them rather than trying to wash them in the sink and then dry them, because it just takes a lot of time. It's doable that way, but I certainly rinse them, place them on towels, allow them to dry as much as possible, and then hang dry them or use them fresh, of course. So if you're looking to harvest, the best time is early in the day. With your leafy annuals, these can be cut back severely, as that example of cilantro. So something like cilantro, you could easily get 2 harvests out of. Same with arugula. Basil will be ongoing, so you could cut that back severely and allow it to regrow for another harvest. With your leafy perennials, you're just going to cut the tips about 1/3 of the top growth, and that's what you harvest annually. And then the seeds as they're turning brown. And here pictured on the lower photograph, you can see that I harvest basil and I stuck it right in a jar of water, and that's how I kept it going. It could also be placed in the refrigerator, but it does well in a well-lit window there and keeps this going. And then you just change out the water every so often. Some other drying methods or preserving methods would be air drying. So you're just drying the leaves or stems. You could place them on screens. You could certainly hang them upside down. When I do that, I like to hang them upside down in a brown paper bag with holes in it, and that will keep any dust particles off of it. The brown paper bag also holds in moisture, and that process usually takes a week to 2. If you're drying with heat, the options are microwave and an oven, certainly a dehydrator, and they do get easily desiccated. Now, after you have harvested, dry them, storing herbs. So your dry herbs, you want to store them cool, dry, dark. If you store the whole leaves, they're going to last a bit longer than crushed. So I like to find jars like this or repurpose empty herb jars. I will label them with the date and they will last a good year or so as dried herbs. Another option would be to freeze certain herbs. So you could freeze things like basil. It will lose its color. Some people freeze it as pesto, and that's okay. It still tastes fine, but the basil leaves do turn brown. And then I also like to freeze chives as well. Now, some tips for bringing these plants indoors. You don't have to bring them all indoors. So what you want to bring in is the ones that you want to use in the winter. Maybe some of them unusual cultivars, or certainly your tender perennials. And you could, again, those tender perennials could be okay in a crawl space or a garage. And then if you want to propagate any of these, of course, you would bring them in and do some propagation exercises. When you're ready to do this, you want to begin early before any, frost hits them, sets them back. If they're in the ground, you'll definitely want to dig up enough of the root system. Certainly inspect for any insect or disease problems, and just recognize that they're going to have to, get acclimated to the indoor situation. So they might take a hit as you first bring them in. So here are a couple herbs that I overwintered indoors just because, they were on my balcony and I didn't have a spot for them in my garden. So this is thyme and oregano overwintered in a sunny window. I could tell you these are looking pretty sad right about now. So they're eager to get outdoors. The thyme is certainly looking a lot better than the oregano. But again, two perennials that I would prefer to put in the ground and leave there if I had the space, but I didn't. So I brought these two in and I was able to get some decent harvest. But right about now they had it and they're ready to be in their outdoor situation. So sometimes you might lose them. It's okay. They got me through the winter, so that was good. Prune back if if there's any dead branches or stems, of course you could prune that back, harvest the leaves as you needed, and just recognize some are easier than others. This did not work at all for my lavender. That's one thing that's pretty tricky to overwinter indoors. A nice resource for you. We have a great herb directory and our herb gardening website at University of Illinois Extension. So be sure to check that out. Of course, you could view past recordings of Four Seasons on our YouTube channel. Jamie mentioned that. And this recording will be up in a couple weeks after we get it closed caption.